I'm very colorful today.
It's funny to see my office in that way.
But it's nice, isn't it? I thought
it is, indeed. It really is.
Do I need to put the monitor higher? No, it's okay.
So I think I'm right in saying that we are now live, and for everyone who's joining us on YouTube, let me begin by saying good evening. My name is Jack Self. I'm the director of the Real Foundation, and it is my enormous pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of Real's English language translation of Kommunen in the Neuen Welt, 1740 to 1972, by Lieselotte and Oswald Matthias Ungers. You may be aware it's almost 50 years ago since the original publication, and it's a book which is dedicated to, this is the new English edition. It's a book which is dedicated to, and that's the original, something we'll be talking about a little bit more later on. It's a book that's dedicated to exploring the history of utopian communities in the New World, which is to say North America. It's really, before I say any more, there's a couple of kind of housekeeping things before we jump into the panels. The first is I want to thank the Graham Foundation, who supported this publication, and particularly the Ungers Archive for Architecture Wissenschaft, without whom it would not have been possible to do this book at all. And of course, we would have liked to be able to thank Lieselotte and Oswald Matthias Ungers themselves. I should say that technically we published this book last year, but due to the pandemic, we haven't been able to organize a physical event. And so we eventually decided that we couldn't wait any longer. And like the rest of the world, we've gone digital, which of course has the great advantage that some of you now are watching from as distant locations as Beijing and New York, as well as Europe. Just to get it right up front, the book is now available for sale to the UK and the rest of the world via Real Foundation /Kommunen, a link that's been pasted into the YouTube stream, and it will be available for European sale very soon from the Ungers archive, and I'll make sure to publicize that widely. We will do so on Instagram and to everyone who signed up for this event. The structure of the launch is in 2 panels. The first will last about an hour and a quarter or so, and will focus on the contents and the context of this remarkable book, the who, the what, the where, the why, the when, the how this book came to be written and published. And then we'll have a short break before the second panel, which will focus on what it means to give form to a translation, and that's with the book's designers. I'm going to move straight to an introduction of panel 1, those people that you can see now. Ooh, sorry, should have put my phone on silent. The panel members for the first panel, we have Winston Hampel, who is the editor and a translator of the book. He's an architectural designer, he's a writer, he's a teacher, he's co-founder of the spatial design practice CPWH, and he is an architect and has studied architecture and design in Hamburg, in Paris, in Stuttgart, and graduated from the history and critical thinking in architecture at the Architectural Association, which I think is where I first met him many years ago. And he's been a unit master of experimental 10, the design unit since 2015, as well as a number of other universities in the UK and in Germany. We're also joined by Sophia Ungers, daughter of Lieselotte and Oswald Matthias. She studied art history at Cornell in Ithaca in New York, and after working at the extremely well-known art gallery Max Hetzler in Cologne, she opened her own gallery in 1989 and has shown many international contemporary artists. During this time, she also realized several Kunstausbau projects for OM Ungers, as well as other clients. And in 1998, she began work at the architectural office of OM Ungers, supporting also Lieselotte Ungers with the administrative work, as well as assisting in curating Ungers exhibitions. In 2011, Sophia became the chairperson of the board of the foundation at the Ungers Archive for Architectural Research. And she's made it a public institution and developed the program, as well as supporting researchers and PhD students in their work. And then finally, we're joined by Anja Siebers-Albers, who studied architecture at FH Dortmund, as well as art history at University Bonn. From 1990 to 2007, she was the press officer and the personal assistant to OM Ungers. And her major focus then was the archive and public relations. And for more than a decade, Anja has been involved in developing many aspects of the UAA, the Ungers Archive for Architectural Research, as well as joining the foundation's board of directors. And her special focus is on postgraduate work and research, on the organization of lectures, exhibitions, and book presentations, which is the context in which everyone joins us this evening. So we'll begin the discussion, and then we'll take some questions from the YouTube chat. So please go ahead and comment there. I'd like to start by asking you, Venstern, about it might seem like an unusual place to start, but one of the first things that strikes you when you look at the original text is the unusual structure of the book. Just purely from the point of view of how it's written, it almost feels like a kind of collage of different academic styles in terms of footnoting and referencing, and even the order of the titles in the chapters. But this kind of inconsistency has a very interesting story behind it. And I wondered if you could maybe start by telling us a little bit about the structure of the book.
Yeah, sure, thanks. Also, thank you for the nice introduction. I guess both of us, I mean, like you said, we met many, many years ago when I still studied at the AA, and we somehow started to discuss this. And then we always treated this as this kind of lost book. And the more and more we discovered, one of the things obviously we discovered was that it is basically a sort of collection of articles from the Swiss architectural magazine Werk, where most of these chapters were first published. There are a few changes when it was published as a book, but primarily the structure remained the same. Some things have changed. The order of publication isn't the order of the publication in the magazines is not the order that they are now in the book, but predominantly one could say these are, essays written for a German-speaking magazine that obviously targeted a German-speaking audience. So Switzerland, Germany, Austria, predominantly, I would guess. And so also that's the way that these articles were in a way written, telling a story from a very distant land. No, back then, it's not like today you said we have people joining us from Beijing or New York or so. I guess there was also still something, you had to tell some stories here in a very different way than you could tell them in America, which, I mean, there's this anecdote maybe of when the first English translation was published later, maybe we'll get to that later, of how that was received in the States itself. But to get back to the fact that how these were written, so they were written journalistically. They were also footnoted and noted and referenced in that way. So not academically, not from that vantage point. And what is also kind of, I mean, maybe quite telling is that there was an interest in getting these articles then published also in the German kind of by a weekly newspaper, Die Zeit. So there was this letter to the editor of the Zeit at the time to publish these, which somehow didn't, I mean, maybe there is somewhere in the archive, there is the response, but we couldn't find it. But maybe that's kind of telling of how the Ungerses approached this topic. It wasn't meant to be for an academic architectural audience, but really for anybody, maybe one could say back home, to talk about this, if you will, phenomenon, and especially when you're talking about the then contemporary communes. I don't know if I fully answered your question there, but I think that's part of what makes it a bit peculiar, this kind of back and forth between very much in-depth research, kind of very detailed research, then a much broader look, and then at times also this very personal look at very specific things where you could tell that they were actually there. So, yeah.
I think in a way that one of our first conversations when we started to look at the text in detail was a realization of how much had been said in the text, but also how much that was referenced that was absent. And that started a research task for you that would last a number of years in terms of trying to locate the original sources. And I think that's maybe an excellent moment to start talking about the Ungers archive itself. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your first journey to the Ungers archive and the relationship that you built up with Sophia and Anya.
Yeah, I mean, it's first of all, Sophia, I mean, it's very nice that you're actually in the archive right now. You're sitting there. So
Yeah.
that's a very good tone for this conversation, I think. I mean, yeah, like you said, when we first talked about it, we thought, yeah, let's translate this book. And then, yeah, sure, you translate a book. But obviously, going back to the fact that they were talking to a German audience, but using predominantly English-speaking sources, at some point, there was a problem because there were quite a lot of quotes which were translated into German from English, but that weren't necessarily referenced because it was like in a newspaper article. So yeah, then Jack and I, we had this conversation also how we treat this, and we started to, okay, let's try to look for the sources. And so I tried, online. I mean, these are marvelous times. You can kind of, if you know the subject and you know how to use the Google a bit, you can kind of trace things, and that set things off. But obviously one hits a certain limit, especially when dealing with, let's say, the communes of the time then, which were often much more ephemeral. No, they kind of existed for 2 years, then disappeared. And so some of these quotes actually were from, leaflets or kind of small, just A4s printed out on a or copied or whatever. And amazingly, and I think that this was my first impression of the archive. When I remember when coming there, nice coffee, and I got some cookies from Anya, and everything was really nice. But then, like you have these treasure boxes, and there were these 2 or 3 cardboard boxes. I'm not sure. I think Kommunen. Yeah.
Right here they are. Do you see them?
Yes, I think we can see them, and I mean, there's a lot in there, and it's in some sort of order. I mean, but I still haven't fully grasped it. But what it definitely is really a treasure chest of material from the time. Like really sort of communal leaflets from the time that they picked up when they visited them or got from students. And so on and so forth. Sorry, Jack, you want to...
No, maybe I can jump in here with Anya, because you've spent a long time working on the material in the archive. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the material from this particular project, what survives and what its history in the archive has been.
For the Kommunen, I think everything survives. They all brought it over from the United States to Germany, all the material, in different ways and in different boxes. And I'm pretty sure that, I mean, that was very interesting to see how Winston was working on the material. And when I read the book again, it was interesting because I read the book first decades ago. And then when you guys were going to translate it, we started to look at the material, And that was very funny to see the material and to see the history of the material, to see the handwritten notes from Lo in the material. And I'm pretty sure that all the material she used, didn't we find every photo, Winston? I think we found everything, every note, every idea, every word, every source in the material, in the 4 boxes. So this is with, and if you ask for the whole archive, it's with a lot of material also by Matthias. There are boxes and full of materials, and he was collecting material and then he was putting it together to a book. And so you find a lot of boxes with material about different themes, and then you can explain how they did the books. I think we don't have material, for example, for the Die Rückkehr des Roten Mannes. This is another book Lo did in the nearly the same time, but I think there are no boxes about that one, but for most of the boxes, for most of the books, for all of the books, you normally find the material in the archive. And it's sometimes it's hard to find it because it's not organized. It's really boxes full of material, not in a chronological way or in an intellectual way. It's material, and then they were putting it together.
You mentioned there another book written by Lieselotte Ungers around the same time, which deals with the conditions of Native Americans. And it's interesting that you say that there's very little or nothing that survives from the preparation of that book, but it does raise one point which I maybe wanted to come to a little bit later, but we may as well touch on now, which is who the ultimate author or primary author of Kommunen is. Because you mentioned it in relation to Lieselotte's other book, which has in some ways similar structure, similar subject matter.
Right.
I don't know if you have any ideas about the way in which Kommunen was written.
Well, no, do you have, Sophia, that way? I mean, I think that Lieselotte Ungers was a very, very, very political person. She was very interested in political things which were going on in the world, or especially in the place where she was living. And when she lived when they came over to the United States, she also Matthias, they both started to be interested they had another project which was mentioned also in your introduction. It's the self-housing system thing, and there were very political times also when they left Germany and when they came over to the United States. It was there was Woodstock and everything, so the students were going on the streets in a different way to Germany, but they did. And so Lo was very interested, and Sophia can tell you the stories that she is. I think you remind quite well that your mother was fighting against the Vietnam War on the street, didn't she?
Yes. Yeah. My father was the chairman of the architecture department, and his wife was sitting in the post office with the children picketing against the Vietnam War, which didn't go so well with all the faculty members, but both parents went down to Washington for the march against the Vietnam War. They both went down. So they were political in a way, and Oma was almost like put into this communist position. But what you were asking, and Anja and I were talking about it this afternoon, I am very certain that Lieselotte did the writing in this book. I know that Matthias went with her to visit the communes that they did visit. I can't say that if they visit all of them, I don't remember that, but and he did take all the photographs, and he supported the idea, but the writing and the research would have been Lieselotte's input. And it's also because she was someone who needed to be more than just a mother and a housewife. So when she was in Germany, she was supporting the office and the architectural office. But when he came to the States and was a professor, there was at that time no architectural office. So she found something to also occupy her intellectually, and she began to write the books. I think that's where this comes from. Yeah, and like I said, I think Ungers did support the idea. They definitely talked about how they would do it or what was interesting in which communes and stuff. But the writing itself is definitely leaves a lot.
Sure, yeah.
I'd love to come back to that in a minute. I'd like to go back to one really primary question to you, Sophia, which is how the Ungers family ended up in America in the first place. Probably most architects will know, especially O.M. Ungers, as being a German-based architect, and probably will be familiar with his time at TU Berlin in the 60s. How is it that the family ended up in America?
Well, he was invited as a visiting critic before he moved there by Colin Rowe. Yeah. And it was also Colin Rowe who invited him to come to the university and be chairman. I think there are several reasons he felt like he needed to change the place and to leave Berlin. One of them, I think, was the project Märkisches Viertel, which is a big social housing project, which went wrong in the view of the press. And he was, although there are many architects who actually were participating in this social housing project, he was the boo man. He was the guy that the press really jumped on. And I think he just needed a change of scenery. The other one is definitely the student revolts, which were making teaching in German universities extremely difficult. The students would hand in white pieces of paper. They would be very calcitrant and not want to study. So he found it a good idea he felt like it was a good way to reinvent himself and go to the States. And of course, we all went with him.
Although there's a certain irony to, of course, leaving Germany from 1967 onwards, the kind of rise of these student protests, leading to 68, 69 being such important years last century in terms of a kind of political awakening of a generation. But it doesn't sound like they found the political climate any more relaxed in the United States than it was in Germany.
No, definitely not. There's also the Black Panthers took over Willard Straight Hall at Cornell, and there was a lot of activism. But I think in a way they were fascinated by the activism being different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I do think that the activism they found in the States was somehow more identifiable than the very radical activism in Berlin at the time. So as Anja said, they did join in the marches against the war, and Lowe did stand in the picket line at the post office, and they felt able to also join in, which they didn't do in the German situation.
Yes, maybe just to add to that, I think there's this very interesting piece of oral history recorded in Cornell from his first, when he had just recently arrived, where he, Oswald Matthias Ungers, talks about his feelings towards that, and where he's at the same time kind of enjoys being able to work with students again, but at the same time is a bit uncomfortable with some of them not being as political as in Berlin, not having such a strong position. So I guess it was this kind of two-sided thing where he could, at least with some of the students, he could work again, which wasn't possible in Berlin, in his words, at some point anymore. He had been very supportive actually of the student, well, not riots, but the student protests at first. And he had, in a kind of student news published newspaper, he had taken a stance pro-student protests against the visit of the Shah, etc. These things. So he had been very vocal also, and he had been kind of the faculty wasn't really kind of happy about that. Actually, his colleagues, some of them were very much against him, and so teaching then at some point became just difficult, like you were saying, Sophia. The blank papers being handed in as a thesis, and so he was happy to be able to teach again in Cornell, to talk about architecture again.
Right.
But at the same time, he was quite also outspoken about the fact that there wasn't so much activism, which sounds strange when at the same time there was the occupation of Willard Straight Hall, and there's this famous image of students walking out of Willard Straight Hall, black students walking out with guns, which for a German must have been quite a sight. Like that's something we're not so used to.
It sounds though that he couldn't necessarily win in the political context, though, because his relationship also with Colin Rowe didn't end up going that well, and it sounds like his political position had quite a lot to do with that.
Political, it's also, I don't want to get into too many details of what went wrong there. I think that's a different subject matter, but it's also, the politics of who gets hired, who gets fired, that sort of thing. That definitely, he was someone who didn't compromise, right? If he thought something was right, then he followed up on it, whether it hurt someone's feelings, whether it was what other people wanted. That wasn't really for him a point to change his thoughts or his ideas were to hire somebody that nobody wanted, then he did it anyway, or to fire somebody. So I think that also had a little bit to do with the situation at Cornell. But I think that is a different.
If we come back to the way in which the book was produced, so I mean, part of the thing which I find really fascinating about the subject matter is precisely the way in which it goes all the way back to the Puritans of 1740 and tries to make a direct connection with what were then contemporary communes of the late 1960s. That's, I think, an easy detail to overlook in terms of how radical this book was for its time. You mentioned, Sophia, that your parents went and visited some, possibly all, of the communes that are featured in the book. I wondered if you had any memories. I mean, what was the process of this? Was it kind of structured research trips, or how was the information gathered?
Well, I do remember that we went to the Amish, and I don't know why they're not in the book. I have no idea. I was going to ask Winston if he has an idea why the Amish and the Quakers aren't in the book.
I don't know why they are not, but there was a draft for them. I mean, and there's material on them in the boxes, but somehow they must have gotten.
But they're still functioning communes, which I think is very strange, I have to admit. But I do remember visiting them, and I remember that Oma was very interested in this Puritan Hutterite handicraft, what do you call it, design of furniture and things. I remember that. But I was little, okay, guys, so you can't expect me to have too much of an intellectual memory on this situation. I was like maybe 8 or 9. So I don't want to mix up my childhood memories too much. But
we
yes.
found lovely vacation pictures, didn't we, Winston, of your family?
Some negatives, which are very nice. I mean, there's this interesting, because you were talking about this, there's this interesting newspaper article from somewhere in the Midwest, a kind of small town newspaper, where they report about a professor from Ithaca coming to town to visit the Hutterite colonies. And that it says something like, in the way at the time was written, his wife is writing a book about the subject matter.
Right.
And he's taking the pictures.
Yes.
And so I guess that in a way like supports what you were saying, Sophia, that he took the pictures. And also in the archive, there's no picture of him anywhere, but
No.
the whole family.
Yeah, the whole family, but no Matthias. So he took them.
But what I do know, for instance, for the book on the Native Americans, the title would be probably not politically correct in today's time. The title was The Return of the Red Man. But it was a time, if I can go there, Jack, do you mind if I just go to that book?
Go for it.
It was a time when the American Indians were also fighting for their rights and wanting their land back and wanting a certain recognition of the wrongs done them. And we did indeed take a motorhome trip. We rented a motorhome and drove through all of America, visiting all the different Indian reservations for about 3 months, the whole summer vacation. We went all the way to California and then back the other way. So I do remember that very vividly. And Omu was always taking the photos or the videos. And Lo was doing the interviews. Some Indians didn't like it and didn't want to be in exhibition and got very angry. And some other tribes invited the family to their rituals. And it was interesting. It was very interesting. And then afterwards, when we came back to Germany, there was a big lecture tour on the American Indians. And Matthias liked to say that he would always sit there and Lo would hold the lecture and he would press the button for the tape on the rituals. Yeah. So that again is a book written by Lo, supported by Matthias, where he is actually the supporting actor and she's the main character, so to speak.
There's certainly a lot of similarities between the two books, also in their structure, in the way in which they handle the subject matter, and also something which I appreciate a huge amount about this book, which is, we should be very open and honest and say that if you want a really detailed academic historical analysis of these communities, there are other books which, and PhD theses which deal with this history in a much greater level of detail. But what I really appreciate about Kommunen, and what made it also easy for me as someone who doesn't speak German to read the original version, is the dry, direct way in which it's written. It doesn't waste time, it gets to the point, and there's not a lot of, in a way, you almost have to sense the emotion or the position of the author through the facts that are presented, which for me is also remarkable given everything we've said about the lives of the Ungers and their position on the world at that time. The book itself is quite direct and relatively objective about the material it's presenting. With that, I wanted to ask you, Vincent, maybe if you would just tell us a little bit more about the communities that are included, and particularly the way in which they're detailed. I mean, what sort of characteristics are the Ungers interested in? Why are they interested in these particular groups?
I guess, I mean, I have to look at the table of contents myself now, but like Sophia was asking, why are they Amish are not included, for example. So there's a certain subjectivity there. I think a focus is on, let's say, most communities of the earlier ones were, but in the historic ones of the time, is on European kind of communities. And then I think there was a sense that they tried to balance out religious communes and, let's say, socialist communes, so like Robert Owen, Fourier, these sort of communes, and people like, let's say, the Amana or Hutterite also. I think in the way they try to look at it, also, if I'm looking at it again now, which is kind of evident even from the table of content, they try to somehow put things in order. They try to make things comparable. And I guess this is something that also in a way goes back to really trying to understand, to get to understand what they were visiting there and to try to make it in some way accessible. for other people, especially for an German audience. And I think so interestingly enough, there are some sentences about architecture, but really the architecture is not as, as much in focus. It's really about the social relationships in there, etc. There's one statement which drew some criticism later when it was published in AD, the British architecture magazine, about that this might be, I have to look it up, but that this might be the first time that Americans can see a sort of architecture not built on the on principles of profit, etc. So, there are some statements of this sort which kind of shoot in, but mostly it's really trying to be very objective, like you say, dry about this, and to make it very much just, which is underlined by the fact now that we have a table in the beginning, where it states how many what the highest membership number was, what sort of, was it religious, where did they come from, England, Germany, France, etc. So I think that was really one of the notions behind this, was to try to make this comparable and to try to understand principles behind establishing these sort of communes. Possibly, as they were saying in the blurb of the book, to draw conclusions for what was then today, also for the contemporary communes, where this sort of, it's still very much kind of short chapters looking at specific aspects in the contemporary communes of the day, but it's a bit more, vague, because these communes were so different in themselves. So, but I think, yes, there was a real impetus to try to use this, to make this accessible and apply it then at the time of so much social change and upheaval.
I mean, it's interesting though. You're absolutely right that there's, in a way, kind of almost three categories of community that are included. The early, the Amana, or the Hutterian, the Bruderhof, we're talking about religious communities, and then the kind of industrialists of Aneda, or the Furious, and so we're dealing, as you say, with socialists of a kind, although it's important to remember that Marx and Engels discounted this form of socialism. They really thought this was not, they argued that you cannot have a kind of reformist model of communism. You have to have a proletariat revolution. And this form of community, which tended to be based on, stemmed from an attitude of care rather than an attitude of revolution, I think was quite antithetical to a lot of what Marx and Engels were interested in at the time. But it's interesting to me that the third category, which are these contemporary or modern communes, the way that they're handled, you're right, is much more anecdotal in a way. And I'm surprised that there's not quite as much attention which is given. I mean, in the previous chapters, if I read out some of the subheadings for these communities, almost every single one deals with administrative structure, with the position of women, with models of education and training, contacts with the public. There's statistics about their wealth and population, as Winston was saying, how their economy works, property, the distribution of goods. And they tend to be quite consistent across the historical chapters, but there's no, rigorous attempt to talk about power relations, gender relations, economic relations. It's much more, it seems to be much more based on a kind of a mood of what the late 60s might have been like. I wondered if you had any kind of reflections on that.
I guess, I mean, I don't know, maybe Sophia, you know more also about how much they visited these communes themselves. A lot, I think, of the material stems from a magazine also, the Modern Utopian, a kind of contemporary magazine, then kind of, maybe one could see it in line with, let's say, the Whole Earth Catalog. All these things were kind of at the time happening, and but they were very divergent, no? As much as the previous communities were divergent. But I guess it's much more difficult to get, or like, let's say, to position yourself outside and try to draw up these categories when things are happening at the same time. So there is in the archive, there is this notebook, copies of a notebook from a student of OMU, who, I mean, we tried to find out who it might have been, but we weren't successful so far, but who sent his experiences and sketches and so from his time living in different communes in the Western United States. But generally, I guess it was really much more based on conversation with people. There are many kind of quotes in that last part, just because it was happening then. I think it was really like, I don't want to call it embedded, but in a way that's what it was. They were kind of trying to make sense of what was happening at the time and what was very much changing at the time. And this is one of the things maybe which is interesting to mention, which struck me, is the kind of, a lot of the material then was also, let's say, from the New York Times and from the New York Times Magazine and so on. So they were both, I guess, well, primarily Lieselotte, who, Sophia, as you said, must have been responsible for the most of the part of or all of the writing, but we're really reading what was going on in the States at the time. And there were a lot of discussions, no? And by the end of, when this book was published, there were already discussions if this commune phenomenon was already on the wane, or was already not kind of being kind of a successful way into the future, which it was maybe when they first started to do their research. So I think it was much more fluid. Maybe that's one thing one could say. Whereas in the historical part, they could rely on also, there were already some books written about these utopian communes. So they could rely on much more research maybe there.
I also think if reading the book, the older communes were really, like you said, utopian, built on an ideology founded by one person who was the intellectual leader and spiritual leader of these communes. While I got the feeling from the 60s, it was more like small clusters of people getting together with not anybody being the ideologist or the boss or the great thinker to say, let's be the Hutterites, or let's be, but rather small clusters of people just living together and trying to be free from the normal society. So I think that you don't have that strict structural backbone for the communes of the 60s, as you would have for the ones in the earlier part of the book. What do you think?
I mean, one of the criticisms, I think, in one of, I mean, there's reviews from the German press to the German publication. One of the criticisms actually was that this relation between the historical ones and the then contemporary ones, the only relation really was that they were called communes. So some people were quite critical, actually, of that, trying to tie it together, which in retrospect is very, very interesting. But I guess then there were very different positions, and they, the book was also kind of, like you were saying, some people were asking, so why isn't it as rigorous with the contemporary communes as with the historic ones? Why aren't there much more strands in between? Except for, like in the book we have now, there's just this intermediate chapter that's trying to link the two. So I guess that's also something I wouldn't say struggled with, but something they tried to make sense of with this book, is really this. And going back to the fact that these were newspaper articles or magazine articles, the whole chapter in a not expanded version as it is now, but was on the contemporary communes, was actually published as one newspaper article in Werk. No? So I guess there were, like, 6 articles on the historic communes and 1 on the contemporary ones. So the balance is kind of, the balance was much more on the historic ones in the articles.
Could I ask you a question, Jack?
Absolutely.
I'm going to turn it around. Why was Real interested in reviving this book, and what do you think is the impact it would still have on us today?
Excellent question. Very glad you asked. I came across this book for the first time in 2014. It was introduced to me when I was studying at the Architectural Association by Pier Vittorio Aureli. And the thing that I'm assuming, given the niche nature of this as a book, that many of the people watching will be familiar with Pier Vittorio Aureli's work. What I've always enjoyed about his writing is following up on the references. He has excellent bibliographies, and often I find, a kind of whole expansive body of literature through the papers or books that are referenced. And it was through that I came across Kommunen. And it struck me for a number of reasons. The first was that I felt a lot of empathy for the relationship with history, which is to say that, history is not, at least to me, something which is a kind of flat or finished entity. It's something which continues to be debated and discussed, and it's very living. And the distance, I think of the distance between us and other periods of time like distance between me and other places. I think there's an English expression which is that the past is a foreign country. I mean, basically, there's nothing conceptually which separates me from the Hutterites except a couple of centuries. So I was very interested by the attempt to create a junction between, and in fact, an entire historical lineage of utopian communes from the 1740s to the early 70s. The reason why this felt so relevant to me was twofold. The first was that after, I think, the financial crash in 2008, and particularly after the Occupy movement in 2011, people my age were once again very interested in anti-capitalist or anti-authoritarian, anti-normative forms of living. And so this began to become quite trendy in a way. So I was very interested by people who had a similar experience almost 40 years before me. The other reason why it was so interesting to me is because, having studied Marx and Engels and been a very kind of studious socialist in many ways, what I couldn't understand was what this book did to my vision of America. I mean, I'd always imagined America to be the absolute pinnacle of capitalist property relations. And here was a book which didn't just show it as being Puritans, as being a historical phenomena, but something that was still going on. And of course, it made me do more research into communes which still exist in the US. Yes. And there was something even radical for me about the fact that Marx and Engels explicitly reject American communism, because that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about the history of communes. So, I mean, I think as one of our blurbs says, very few people would think of America as being a communist country, or a country which invented a different type of communism. In as much as we're talking about the diversity and richness of these communes between them, there is also a diversity and a richness of all social structures, which tends to get flattened out by these terms. We use communism, we think of the Soviets. We maybe think today of China, but we don't think of it, and we use the term capitalism without necessarily as well acknowledging that capitalism in Chile is very different from capitalism in Canada or capitalism in Switzerland or capitalism in Indonesia, and that in every location it arrives, it has fundamentally different principles. So for me, this was a real moment of awakening in which I started to think about America as an origin point for a different type of communism, and particularly as an architect, a form of communism which, as I mentioned, was based on an attitude of care, which was not based on an attitude of violence. There are almost none of these communes are based on ideas of, they have, let's say, some principles of exclusion in order to preserve the community, but they're not elitist by their nature. And so this was, something which I really appreciated a lot personally. But then, of course, there's a big gap between just liking a book and wanting to, invest a number of years in trying to get it realized as an English translation. And the reason for that was I'm mainly thinking of our American comrades. I'm thinking less of our European friends, and I'm thinking more of our friends in America. And in that sense, I think the book has only become more relevant as time has gone on. And we've started to see in the United States, the polarization, increasing polarization, and a frustration by many Americans that I know with the state of politics and the state of contemporary life in America, which makes it not unlike the late 60s, as far as I can understand. So I'm very excited to be able to present back to Americans the fact that none of us have to be capitalists. And in fact, if we were looking for an alternative history, America is the richest place to look for exactly the type of communism which I think could be relevant today. Anyway, that's my little mini diatribe. But sorry, Anya.
I have another question. I had the same feeling like you when I read it. I thought, well, this is a completely different way of America. You were thinking about it today. You only see the capitalism and the rich country, and you don't see the old idea of going over to the land of the free and so on, But why, if they did the book in the 17th, and if they did it about America and in America, why don't you think they didn't do it in 2 languages? We have a Spanish translation.
Yes.
And we have 2. We have the from 78 and an Italian translation. Why do you think they didn't do that directly in 2 languages?
There's a kind of strange twist to I'm going to mention Alvar Aalto, who has a boat, and the boat is called Nemo Propheta in Patria. No man is a prophet in his homeland, which I've always thought is very ironic, because if there was any architect who was a prophet in his homeland, I mean, the Finns worship the master Aalto. So, but nonetheless, this is, of course, a quotation from Jesus, that in order for Jesus to spread the word, he had to leave the Sea of Galilee and Nazareth in order to be taken seriously as a prophet. And my thoughts about why it wasn't translated into English are that if you're trying to generate excitement, curiosity, I think the book, and we've already mentioned it a couple of times, the book has always one eye back towards Europe and always one eye back towards the impact that it might be able to have on particularly a European and German context. So from that point of view, I don't know if it was, I think my understanding of it as a message is much more like, here is a book for Europe, which says, although we've left, we're still involved with exactly the same types of concerns, which we had when we were leaving, Berlin in '68. And it seems to me in a way, almost using America as an excuse to send a message to Europe. But perhaps I've misunderstood that. I don't know if anyone else here has a thought about that.
Well, it could just be a practical thing that they had connections to publishers in Germany and didn't have connections to publishers in America. And Lowe couldn't write English. So it could just be a very practical thing. Sorry, Winston, you were going to say something.
No, I mean, there was this abbreviated version of it in AD, so maybe that also, articles, which was quite an early translation of it, but very abbreviated, just 7 or 8 pages, I guess. So maybe in a way that already, said, that was done. The English version was out, even though it was very condensed. There wasn't the energy anymore to do another English translation, also possibly. I guess in a way there's a certain, maybe the circumstances just shaped it. Especially, I mean, this is this interesting anecdote now about this reader's letter in a 2 months later from another issue of AD. There's a reader's letter, which is quite like, hey, who are you to talk about America?
From Dolores Hayden.
Yeah, by Dolores Hayden. And not in the way like, who are you to do this, but really, hey, there are things we here have already studied, which we are studying. It's a bit kind of confrontational, but probably coming from also from the fact that I think, if I'm correct, Dolores Hayden was working on the subject at the time. And I guess she's one of the most studied scholars on the subject and already then was working on it. So she kind of made some factual corrections in a very short but condensed reader's letter. So I don't know, maybe there was already a feeling that they had more competence in a way, talking back to Europe, looking at it from a European perspective, but that's really just speculation on my part now. Yeah.
I mean, it's also super interesting. When I mentioned earlier that there are, academic books which cover the subject in much more detail, Dolores Hayden was one that I had in mind. But again, I think her book on the subject is 700 pages or more, and in ultimately actually having read Hayden's book, all the key points are actually carried by Kommunen. I mean, and I think in that sense there's a great efficiency to it. Which is important. The other reason maybe to mention, I mean, the need for an English translation, because that's also maybe something to mention, is that once it's an unusual book, Kommunen, in that once I started looking for it, I started to find references to it in many, many places, and in unusual places as well. In 2017, I went to Australia and met Rem Koolhaas. And the first thing, I mean, he's famously a man who is not interested in small talk. He's extremely direct, bordering on impolite. And the first thing he said to me was, "I understand that you're doing a translation of Kommunen." And I said, sort of a bit surprised, jet lagged as well. I said, yeah, that's the hope. We're just starting out on it now. And he said, I will follow that with great interest. I've always appreciated that book. And of course, he told me that he used to recommend it as reading material to people who joined OMA in the early 80s, and that they used to have many copies of it around the office. So it's kind of something which is clearly, and of course, many of you will be familiar with Koolhaas's, he went specifically to Cornell in order to study with Ungers and had did a number of projects with Ungers afterwards. And I mean, one could get more into that, but that's a separate subject. The point is more that whether it's through figures like Koolhaas or O'Reilly or a number of other subjects or groups where I started to investigate what it was that was on their reading list and what was motivating them to explore contemporary utopian communes, including a number of associations in Zurich. This was a kind of cult book that was being passed around as a kind of reference material. And so in that sense, the fact that it was being only limited to the German world seemed to me like a very unusual kind of artificial limitation on the text.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway,
I mean, interestingly, now when we started, I think I ordered my copy for €3.45 or something, like some weird secondhand bookshop sum. But now it's really hard to get a German original. So, the hope is in a way that some of the Germans will now have to go through the English version to actually find the original. No, but it's as you say, it's an interesting kind of cult. It somehow pops up here and there in kind of antiquarian bookshops, but it's not kind of readily available just anywhere, which is.
Yeah, we only have 2 more copies here. So.
Wow.
Yes.
One more question. Do you, either you, Jack, or Winston, do you think this book would be a way of also, because there's a lot of talk in architecture of how to find a new form of architecture, a more communal form of architecture. How do you structure a city in a more communal way? Do you think this translation of this book will help to further this discussion of new living forms or new, housing forms?
I'll say yes, because I want people to buy the book. But the full answer is a bit larger, which is, again, a kind of personal reflection from my side, which is, in the last 5 years, especially, as I've spent much more time doing, amateur research into new discoveries in archaeology and sociology and anthropology, I have been amazed by one fact, which is that humans have remained pretty much biologically unevolved for 200,000 years, which means that people 200,000 years ago, if we had a time machine and could bring them to the present, would be no different from us. That kind of realization has only recently started to be taken seriously in archaeology and anthropology, by saying that everything that we have today are political discussions, are debates about the best way to organize ourselves, the best way to live together, how to distribute resources, how to design a town, that these things have not just been happening in the last 5,000 years since agriculture and the first cities and states, but in fact have been going back 200,000 years. And there are incredible discoveries, archaeological discoveries, especially being made in North America and Central America, showing colossal cities of 20,000 people or more in the absence of any sustained agriculture. These are kind of seasonal cities and so on. And at least for me, Kommunen sits within an education I've tried to give myself about the fact that since I am not satisfied with how we live today, with the structures of our societies and the way that resources are distributed and our relationship with the natural world, it's incredibly inspiring to me to understand what the alternatives are. And that's why history for me is much more powerful than any science fiction, because we're not talking about imaginary worlds. We're talking about, the real people who lived in these and who committed themselves. You think of someone like Robert Owens putting almost all of his money into trying to create an alternative structure to mainstream society. And that gives me a lot of hope that if we're dissatisfied with contemporary society, there is a possibility for change. And Kommunen for me is one part of that history, which for a long time, growing up in the 1990s, I was told there is no alternative, that capitalist Western democracy in its current form, that was it. It's finished now.
I think if you look at America at this point, we know it's the problem, but that's what I found too when I read it again. For instance, the Hutterites, with the idea that if the community got too big, they would split and start a new community, so that the community would always stay within a size that's manageable to be a commune. You cannot be too large, which it would be against these high rises being too big, or cities, you just become anonymous and you no longer care for each other. And I think that's something you definitely learn from this book, is to be a commune, to be caring for the other people. It needs a certain nucleus, a smaller social network.
And there's something present in this book which is really important and very in line with Reel's ambitions, which is it's very evidence focused. It's really interested in what the material and daily conditions of people were. So although there is, space given to the ideology behind a lot of these communes, there's some very practical, as you say, very practical considerations about how this actually functioned and how this worked. And that's incredibly useful, because I would argue that the inclusion of Robert Owens is basically a kind of cautionary tale, that if someone rich turns up and puts a lot of money and says, we're going to create a commune, all that happens is, people who want money go there and you end up with something which doesn't work. Whereas perhaps so I think the comparative structure, the way in which the book deals with the advantages and disadvantages of different rules and structures, I think is that's for me what sets it out as a very kind of practical guide to look at.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have thoughts on this, Winston or Anya.
I know that the Kunstakademie Düsseldorf, together with the KU Leuven, for example, is doing in the summer a new summer school, and it's the fourth one in this cooperation. We have a cooperation. The Ungers archive has a cooperation also with them, and they are doing without knowing that the book is going into translation. They suggested to have the theme Kommunen in der Neuen Welt for the new summer school. I think we should follow what these guys, young students, are going to do with the book and with the inside of the book.
I think maybe one thing to add to this question of how is this maybe, I don't know, relevant, or what can this add to discourse today, is that I think, and Jack, we also discussed this quite a lot now. It's, on the one hand, it's a book about communes, historic and then contemporary. So historic from both of them, is historic today. So, but on the other hand, it itself has become a historic document.
Yeah.
I think that was also towards kind of, the second half of the project, when we realized that we really have to put a lot of effort into editing and finding the sources and getting to know much more about the background. Is, I think part of it is, like you were saying, Jack, there are alternatives, and I think the owners were looking for these alternatives, and the book is a kind of result of that. Also, if we look at Omu at the time, how he was shifting from being an architect in Germany, building, being very much criticized, like you were mentioning, for the Märkisches Viertel or so, then going to Cornell and not really building anything for 10 years. And that's exactly this kind of fulcrum moment of his career, is kind of when the Kommunen research, obviously mostly driven by Lieselotte, I guess, but it falls in line with a lot of what he seems to have been interested in, and what he was talking about in this oral history, and his interest in social justice, also racial justice, equality. He was very much interested in these things. So I think it's interesting to reread the book against that backdrop of somebody from Europe, somebody who wasn't a radical per se, was kind of came from this very much academic background, but really trying to find alternatives. And I think that is something that's quite interesting to look at today as well, from that perspective.
Yeah, I did write down that I wanted to say, I think a lot of establishment people found the hippie communes of the 60s, there are some quotes of them being drug dens or excuses to drop out and to not finish school or whatever. It was a very negative, they had partly negative connotations to them, especially from the establishment. And I think it's very interesting that someone like Lo and Matthias would actually say, no, we're taking this serious. This is a very interesting form of living together. It is something one should look at and also study. And they're not all just druggy dropouts. I think that shows how open-minded and how accepting they were of these lifestyles and of like you were saying, of this situation.
I think in the last 5 or 10 minutes, I was hoping to get some questions from the YouTube. We have 2 issues with that. The first is that we have a 60-second lag, which makes asking questions a little bit difficult. But the only specific question we've received is regarding our attitude on Nietzsche and Kommunen. But I'm not qualified to answer that question because I haven't read Nietzsche's Vom Nutzen und Nachteil der Historie für das Leben. I don't know if anyone else in this chat has.
No.
No. In which case, I wondered instead to phrase it another way and say, what have we missed out? What is important about this book that has not been said? I wondered if anyone had anything they wanted to add.
Well, I thought maybe it'd be interesting to see if the communes of the 60s, what happened to them. Are there still communes from the 1740s? And yeah, as in the book, there are still the Hutterites are still there, and they live in Canada and the Great Plains, and they've actually grown in numbers up to 50,000. I found in the internet, yeah, and the Amish and the Quakers were not in the book, but that was something I thought was interesting. And then also there's a trend to again go into the social living, especially through Corona and what you were saying about Occupy Wall Street, and especially through the climate change discussion. There are many people who are saying, I want to drop out, I want to come back to nature, I don't want to consume all the things that are ruining the climate. So there is a whole new movement, I think. I don't know if it is. I'm not really doing research on this, but I have a feeling there are more people now interested in looking for new forms of living than before. Does any of you guys have an opinion to that?
Anya or Winston?
Yeah, I think it's in many ways there are interests there. No? Also in the architectural world, let's say, from kind of very, let's say, simple, I don't want to say simple is the wrong word, but much more basic forms of living, like Baugruppen or so, these kind of movements that are not entirely new, but that have gained much momentum, you know, new kind of, let's say, people getting together again, trying to find way of how to finance housing in a very kind of heated market or so. So I think there, on many levels, there are new attempts are being made to to find new ways of how to live together. And I think that's essentially very similar across these, what was then, you know, 200 something years and is now, you know, almost 300 years of history of these communes. Maybe it's not communes today necessarily, but still we are, or maybe more than ever, we have to find alternatives. No? And I think, like you were mentioning, climate change or these sort of things, and COVID, so it really pushes an alternative. It really makes this discussion very urgent. So yes, we are there. Probably we've never left the discussion. We should have never left that discussion out. But I think now it's becoming more and more topical. And I guess, yeah, in academia also, yes, the discussion, I also have that impression.
Yeah, I think so too. I have the same feeling. The climate thing is one thing, but my experience is that the multi-generation, more generation living together is really popular and is really a theme, and it's coming back as a theme. And these are more generation communes, and they live together and in like little communes, because it's every age in this group, and this comes really back, and it's very popular, I think.
We do have one question. There's a couple of questions in the chat, but one that I did want to pose to you, I think, Winston, you're best placed to answer this, which is, why was the book translated into Spanish?
Yeah.
Or perhaps someone else here is able to answer this as well. I mean, it does seem rather unusual that it was given in Italian and a Spanish translation. Do we have any sense of why that might have been?
I don't know. Unfortunately, we can't open to the audience, but I had some help from a friend in translating the preface to the Spanish version, which is interesting for a couple of reasons, because it also is critical. It's mostly critical at first about the term America, and that's obviously coming from Spanish point of view. America, this is not America. America is much larger than that. There were communal experiments in Southern America or Middle America, which are not looked at. So it was kind of critical on that. Overall, it's a quite critical introduction, which is very interesting, which is something I think we're not so used to today anymore, to publish something, but at the same time say it's good, but this, and that. But rather than maybe being able to provide an answer, I thought it was even more striking that there was a Spanish translation, because this was still, I think, under Franco. No, so I
Mm.
think this was still kind of before the transition to democracy in Spain. I think at least the first one is definitely, and I'm sure I will get some feedback on this from Spanish friends, but is published in Barcelona also.
Yes.
So I think there must be a very interesting history behind it. But I'm not, unfortunately, my Spanish is not good enough to dive into researching that, I think, and I have no answer really. But I think I have the Spanish translation here, but that doesn't really help.
This is the cover. This is the cover.
Oh, that's the Spanish one, is it?
Yeah, that's the Spanish one.
Interesting.
Yeah, Gerardo Brown Manrique was sending that to me yesterday. He has the Spanish one, and he was student in Cornell.
I mean, it's exactly what Winston was saying, which is that it's pretty unusual that the cover talks about the New World, which from a European perspective is all of North America, and yet it's only the United States which is highlighted. Mm-hmm. But there is maybe one other question which I wanted to ask. It's a question, I'll read the question, which is, do you feel that the internet serves to decentralize or recontextualize the ideas described in this text in a meaningful way? I'd maybe like to add to that or expand it, particularly in relation to what we're talking about with an archive, which is the ability to disseminate but also to preserve particular ideas, and how physical versus digital communities work. I mean, should we be trying to upload and put all of this material in your archive online, for example, or is it better that it remains physical? And what is the importance of dissemination and discussion? I mean, that's at least how I understand the question, but I don't know, perhaps Anya, you want to take a crack at that one?
I don't have an answer to that because I really don't know. On one hand, I think, yes, we should put everything online so it's available for everybody. And on the other hand, I think, no, it has to be there physical and people have to come to watch it. But it's two hearts in my body. I can't give you the answer.
Sophia or Winston?
Well, I'm a very analog person. I'm probably the wrong one to ask. I like the feel of paper and the smell of older paper and the which you'd lose, and the size of something, the relation of a size, which everything goes away all on the internet and on a computer, all of the same size, whether it's this big or if it's this big, it's all reduced to whatever your computer screen can show you. So I am definitely for an archive, and I don't think we can replace everything with the digital copy. Last word goes to you, Winston.
I guess I mean, yes, it's a both and. I guess I'm at the same time, like I was saying, there is this treasure hunt moment, when you open a box in an archive like these, and it's really kind of a bit, it's obviously a bit fetishizing this, but the physical, but there is something to finding the original typescript with handwritten notes on it,
right, and
then reflecting that to the book that was published. There's something about that, holding it in your hand. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I mean, this book, this translation, I think wouldn't have been possible 15 years ago or so, before, let's say, the whole New York Times, since I don't know when, was digitized, and all the articles are accessible, searchable. So in that way, we were able to trace these sentences and find out where they come from and then translate them accordingly. So I think, I guess it should be both digitized and remain. But yeah, that's also a bit of a cop-out answer, I guess.
I am going to, I think, draw a conclusion to our panel now. But I want to thank you all for being here in this digital room this evening. And it's really a great privilege to have you all here. You've obviously all been instrumental to the creation of this book, and without your dedication and all of your work on this for so many years, we wouldn't be here now. So I want to thank you very, very, very much. To the audience, we will take a 4-minute break, and then we'll return to talk with the designers of the book about translation. Yeah, thank you again.
Thank you, Jack, for taking this effort and huge step to translate the book. I'm very pleased that it has come out.
My great
really look
pleasure.
forward to seeing the English version when it comes.
Yes, yeah, actually on that, I mean, not that our audience needs to worry about that, but I'll send you the tracking information. Brexit is a nightmare. However,
Yes.
There's a downside, which is that it takes a huge amount of time to have anything shipped anywhere, and it's very unpredictable. But the upside is, and I don't mind saying this publicly, your shipment has been issued as a gift, and therefore will have no tax on it.
That's
So
very
this is
that. I hope you didn't put an invoice in there.
no, obviously not. We've had, I mean, actually, we're still in an argument with FedEx about the import, because the book was printed in Lithuania, and so it was shipped from Lithuania to Britain, and there is an ongoing customs argument between Lithuania and Britain as to whether or not Kommunen should be charged VAT, which I haven't resolved yet. But in any case, I'm going to. I must wrap this up, otherwise we'll have no gap between the two presentations.
How do I get onto? I then go on the link.
I'll send you a link to the YouTube. It should also have been in the email that I sent.
Yes, I just go on that link.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Right.
Bye.
See you then. Bye bye, guys.
See you later.
Great to talk
Bye, guys.
to you. Bye bye.
Bye. Hey, how's it going?
Hi.
Are we live right now?
Are we on?
You're absolutely live. You're live on YouTube, guys. Although, I mean, we'll begin in just a minute, I guess. But very nice to see you both.
Yeah,
Nice
likewise.
to see you too.
Interesting discussion.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was cool.
I had no idea that there were two other existing translations of the book.
Yeah,
We were googling the book covers as
we all like,
as you were talking.
that one wasn't as nice. That one's all right. That one.
Which one do you think's okay? The Italian one?
I kind of like the Spanish ones.
The Italian.
The Italian was a bit.
I mean, you can't beat this though. It's a classic.
Well, what's interesting is I wonder if I don't know. I wonder if we would have done anything differently had we known that those ones existed prior, and that someone else had
No.
thought that it was okay to do something completely
We would
different.
have made 3 versions.
Right.
Yeah.
The same stamp on the other.
High English, like normal English,
Right.
Middle English,
And Scouse.
and Esperanto.
And Esperanto. There you
Yeah.
Before we launch right into it, I should actually take a moment just to introduce you both and then pass over to you. But of course, I'm talking to Seb and Chris, who are the designers of this translation. Christopher Lawson is an Irish graphic designer, probably familiar to many of you as a partner of Villalba Lawson over the past decade or so. He has established his own practice in 2020, which is based in London, and he works independently and in collaboration with all sorts of amazing people on a variety of cultural projects, including with Seb. And I'd say he has a specific focus or interest in art, design, in fashion, publishing. Seb McLaughlin is an independent designer based in London since 2015, which is when I met you, I think, specializing in graphic and type design. You've worked with Real a lot, including very extensively on Real Review right from the beginning, and also Mies in London and a number of other projects that we've worked on. I think Home Economics as well. I mean, basically everything.
Yeah, it's maybe important to mention with OKRM.
That's exactly right. Yeah, which is when I met you. You were with OKRM, and in how long have you been independent now? It must be at least 3 or 4 years.
2019, but you know,
2019.
As you know, I've left OKRM, but I can never leave. They're always in my heart.
We are part of that family. That's for true. That's for sure. You've also been working recently with Quaidan Editions, Alexander McQueen, and those of you interested in typography will definitely know his work with Dynamo Type Foundry, based in Germany. He's also a lecturer and critic, and he teaches type design at Kingston School of Art. So welcome to both of you. I think you mentioned earlier, Seb, that you had a short presentation that you wanted to show.
It will last the duration of the 20 minutes, half an hour that we have allocated.
It could. I mean, I think like after such like interesting and like thoughtful and intellectual discussion, I think Chris and I just wanted to be dumb graphic designers and just like show people some visuals.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But hopefully some like insightful perspectives on the very interesting and challenging process of translating and giving shape to this
tremendous
already
work.
Beautiful book.
Yeah.
I don't want to preempt too much what it is that you might be about to say, but I do want to give some context to this, because it's often that you have a book launch in which you don't have a presentation or commentary from the designers. And to me, I've always found this extremely unusual because of the amount of work and also the amount of intelligence which goes into book design, which is equal to the intellectual and creative endeavor of making the words. In this particular case, we're dealing with a translation, a book-to-book translation. And as Winston mentioned before, there's something really unusual about Kommunen in that a lot of the way that it was written was missing a lot of references, which created an interesting kind of translation problem for us. But I don't want to preempt too much what you might be about to say, although I have a copy at hand in order to point to specific things. But perhaps you want to go ahead and give us your spiel.
Yeah, let's do it.
So
we do the share screen button. We do the desktop button. We press the share button on the bottom right. Yeah. And we get the key.
Okay.
And we press play.
Press play.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. Can you see that?
Yeah. Can you see that, Jack?
Yes.
All right. Awesome.
Well, we should preface it by saying that we approach this project as we do kind of all projects from the kind of perspective of train spotters, and that's what we have here a bunch of young train spotters about to peruse a train. And so,
I mean, that's what kind of brought us together to work on this in the beginning, was like a love for detail. Like Chris and I have worked together on this, but in informal ways. We share the same studio space, and we're constantly together with Liam as well, who's here on the mez with us. Like we're constantly throwing ideas and references and little details and like massaging what would appear to most people in the world as incredibly inconsequential, like little details, but to us are like really important. Yeah, so do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the following kind of section of the presentation is a sort of retrofitted assemblage of various translations and facsimiles that we looked at more directly or somewhat loosely when approaching this book. So I think it's fair to say that some of them are far more relevant to the process of making Kommunen than others, but I think they're all kind of interesting case studies to talk about even briefly and describe.
Yeah, because it's an interesting challenge. Basically, what Jack set us was to translate a book, and like the kind of question of like, what do you do as a graphic designer with something that's already been made, is like an interesting thing. And we wanted to kind of show some other examples of a few different ways of doing it. One which is straight up translation, and we can kind of define that as we go along. Another one is a facsimile, so like a real reproduction of it. And another one's a complete interpretation, so like really taking kind of
creative liberties.
Exactly.
Giving it shape.
So we made like a nice little graphic design diagram. So like the first example would be like a translation, and we picked like Faden or Fiden as like a very good example of this. Like it's like a take your brains out approach to design. It's like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So you can see like it's why use different art, why use a different typeface, why use a different format if it's literally saying the exact same thing. And they, I mean, Chris, you've worked with Fiden, like
yeah, and this is a kind of a means to which they applied all of their the design of all their books, where the type is literally like the final plate that's added to whatever's below it, so that they can economically reprint books in the language of whatever country wants.
They have it down to like a science with like the amount of weight of the paper and like the inflation rate and like how all of that kind of macroeconomics and how that impacts their bottom line when they're selling like literally tens of thousands of cookbooks. And like going even further into it is like one publication that Chris and I were quite interested in just showing like as a kind of case study. This is like The Lord of the Rings, which is interesting in its connection to Kommunen, because it's like it's been in publication for a very long time. Also came out, well, like became very popular in the mid 20th century. And, you know, you can see that as it's gone to different markets and gone through different iterations, like the design has been interpreted a few different times.
Yeah, and different periods, right? Because I think like the previous covers are probably from the 90s or early 2000s. And so, yeah, the cover, at least that's what we're talking about here, kind of, it takes the form of that place and that time.
Yeah, and even those cultures.
And those cultures.
Yeah,
right.
we found these amazing Japanese ones, which are like absolutely insane. And another way of kind of understanding this is also in a more contemporary sense. Some of these are books we have around is looking at catalogs of like exhibitions that tour around the world. So this is like the Stedelijk interpretation of what Matisse's cutouts are, and this is the Tate Modern's interpretation. So completely different sensibilities and completely different approaches to exactly the same content, essentially.
Yeah, but kind of like the institution dictating, you know, what form is given to the design of the book.
Yeah.
And this is going on to the inside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And ultimately, like a lot of these things are just formal changes. Like it's just like, okay, we want to use an ultra gridded approach. We want to use like a very like loose approach. So it's sort of like pick and choose for no reason in a way. Like it just, in some cases, it's almost like ego.
Yeah. Or follow some sort of corporate guideline, I suppose, that's already been determined by
very accommodating.
By the design of the institution.
Yeah.
This is another interesting one. Two kind of counterparts. It's a book that is transcribing the legal Holy Bible. It transcribes the legal battle between Richard Prince and the owner of this image, which he then reinterpreted as his own artwork.
Yeah, we have like some very low res. Unfortunately, this is not one that we had, but you can see that it's like there are some elements that are like literally ripped from the Xerox copies of the court transcription, and then there are some that are completely reset within like a new arbitrary kind of style of text. And the actual author of this, Greg Allen, went a bit further into after the original copy went out of print, he ended up republishing it himself. And then in this situation, he literally produced it as a facsimile, just photocopying the A4 or letter-sized transcripts from the court case, which takes us to this one.
Yeah. So I mean, this is much closer to like a direct. Is a facsimile of original publication. So here, sort of looking at the similar considerations that we had with this book, where, as far as I understand, the paper used on the interior and the cover was matched as closely as possible to the original, also the kind of spiral binding. So it's a much more direct copy to the original artifact. And
these pages would have just been probably scanned and then just reprinted as one full plate rather than movable type or like an InDesign document. So that's a whole different workflow, and it's something that we had to kind of consider as we were working on the book. There's another one that's recently published by Roman Publications, which pushes a little bit further into adding new elements. Like there's an addendum which kind of grounds it and contextualizes it. This publication was very inspiring.
Yeah. And I think I kind of remember today that I think we even we got in touch with Roma.
We called them.
Yeah, we phoned them and asked them what process they'd used in reproducing this book, because again, it, unlike the previous one, it dealt with a lot of imagery, which obviously Kommunen has, and they had done it in such an accurate way that it was kind of worthwhile us getting a foot up and knowing how they went about it, which we'll get into.
Yeah, particularly within the photos and the print reproduction. This Yvonne Rayner is another sort of example. Like this is again like a very faithful facsimile of like some incredible content, same format, and just running it through a kind of a reprinting process essentially. Right, I believe is this the same? I'm not familiar with the original one, Chris.
Well, also published by the same guys, Primary Information, but unlike the previous example that we've shown, like there was a little bit of kind of creative liberty taken in that Artright was a series of magazines, where here it's being kind of like placed into a compendium, and so obviously a cover has to be designed rather than facsimiled. So there's a little bit of kind of design on their part here.
Here we are with the real Holy Bible. So this is I think it's like quite a famous book in a way, where it's like using the Bible as a kind of like basis. So there's a complete reproduction of the Bible in here, but using it as a kind of framework to then put some collage and like interpretive elements essentially on top to kind of make you think of some of the themes of violence and, I don't know, humor, I guess, that happens within the Bible. I haven't read the Bible in a long time. So
it's been a while. I think it's also worth pointing out that I think, I'm not sure for certain, that the actual Bible aspect of it has been sort of typeset and printed as opposed to copied. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously the actual content itself is copied, but it's
like put into a format that is like faking a Bible.
Right.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And this is a fairly recent publication. I think a few years ago. How long?
I don't know. I want to say like 8 years ago now.
This is back when Raven Row Gallery in London was still sort of operating in a traditional sense. It's since kind of closed publicly. But this is like a kind of, I guess, a greatest hits of like particular interesting issues that happened within there. And there's again like an addition here which kind of grounds it within the context within which it was published, like back in the early 2010s. But again, it's really like just taking the plates, printing them again, matching as much like the format. I don't think the paper, like I think you can see paper texture here. So they've even scanned and just printed it black and printed paper texture, which is quite a weird thing to do as a graphic designer.
I guess it's more of almost like a photocopy rather than a facsimile.
Yeah, a Xerox. Yeah.
Right.
Cool. So we kind of like did, again, very graphic designer thing where we plotted all these out. But if we think of this as a kind of matrix, you can see that there are it's a kind of spectrum, and a lot of the choices, very specific choices, kind of create a kind of movement towards one of these axes. And I think with Kommunen, Chris and I were really interested in trying to find somewhere between a facsimile and a translation, which is maybe a revival. That's a word that gets used a lot within type design. But what it essentially means is, and I guess it's something maybe, Jack, you've probably, and a lot of architects have experience with, where you're handed a building that is functionally great. It's just about reviving it, making sure that you're not messing it up with whatever alterations or modernizations you have to make. So if it ain't broke, cool.
Don't fix it.
Don't fix it, I guess.
So I think it's fair to say that Seb and I had sort of ambitions as to how we could make the book our own after understanding the kind of concept of the book itself. There's this original, and then there's an expansion. There's a sort of running commentary written by Winston.
But it's fair to say when we were first given the brief, like the book was just a straight translation. There wasn't as much gold understood like from Winston in that point. It was really just like repurposed it into English.
Yeah. But I don't, and I may be wrong, but I don't know that we actually had a copy of the original book at that point. And the point that I wanted to make is, once we had actually received what you're seeing here, I think it was immediately obvious to us that it was in itself a beautiful thing, and that we maybe didn't want to
imprint our own ego onto it.
Right.
Like, let's redraw this map in our own way.
Right.
Like in a 2020 in a 2020 way.
In a 2020 way. Is there a way that we can retain the original but then kind of build out these newer parts to it?
So we're just going through some things that are like interesting to us as graphic designers. Like the first thing is that there's no indents within the paragraphs, which is like a very interesting move, perhaps made to keep the production costs lower, because I think back in these days it would have been hand set. So it might have made the typesetting of the book easier in some way. I'm not sure really, but it was an interesting little detail.
Yeah, I think it was one of the more obvious sort of typographic details that we picked up on. And then here there's just, certain inconsistencies that we did decide to iron out. Like here, looking at the formatting of the contents page.
Yeah. But also like the typographic palette itself is like very, very simplistic, where there's really some key characters within the typography of Helvetica and Garamond, and just placing them within a very simple template. It's almost like a word template in a way. And again, there's more kind of inconsistencies, or straight up probably mistakes. There is like really interesting tables with like asterisks and like misalignments within text.
Yeah. And here, I think this is one of the kind of bigger challenges that we had, which is where German is approximately 30% longer than English. And so we knew before going into the actual typesetting of the translation that there was going to be a shift in actual like volume of content, and the place the pages at which things like this table here on the bottom left would actually fall. So I think there was a little bit of fears that these things were going to kind of fall on very
inconvenient
exactly, inconvenient points.
Yeah, for sure. There was also like within the images, there was no way like Jack and Winston and Sophia, I'm sure, like searched high and low, but there was no actual negatives or enlarged versions of these photos that we could take from. So all of the bleed to get these to the edge of the page had to be in a way invented. And I don't think we're going to go into detail how we did that because it's not very conservatory, but we did it. And you can take a look at the book yourself. It doesn't look weird. You can read into that what you will.
I think just as a little tidbit, I think at some point we had spoken to Winston about getting hold of the original work papers because the images had appeared in some of those documents, and we were kind of hoping that maybe the bleed existed in those particular instances. But I think it just became easier for us to kind of artistically add to the image rather than going down that other route.
Yeah, like there are some things like justified captions, like a different font being used for the diagrams, and an inconsistent image grid, and like very interesting image content in itself. So the sort of end of the book, the end of our analysis of the book, is it's a really interesting design filled with some inconsistencies and some things that needed to be almost modernized. And like, you know, like certain structural elements maybe within a house or a building need to be modernized. We just change a couple of things, but we want to keep the facade and the kind of the general vibe of the place intact. So great. What did we actually do? We haven't actually talked about what we did, which is interesting. So the first thing that we took a look at was, of course, the cover, because that's, I guess, what most graphic designers do when we get a book project. Because that's what sells, I guess, the book.
Yeah, because I think at this point, like, we'd probably agreed on how we were going to approach the inside of the book. I mean, at a very top level. Yeah. And the cover being the cover, it kind of required its own thought and its own approach. And so we're going to kind of show you some ideas that didn't quite make it to the cutting board
because they're really bad. But you can see within just these bad sketches. But our ambition was from immediately either completely modernize, like here, like abstract it completely, or repurpose or reuse or use the language between German and English. But what we landed on was sort of, in a way, like the idea of layering, and that being an interesting metaphor. And this was before we really figured out just how much potential there was within this idea, because we hadn't really heard from Winston at that point. Yeah. So this was the kind of result. This is the old book on the left and the new on the right. And it's just this addition of clarifying it into English and like a new graphic element that makes it new, because if it's not broke, like why do we need to make a new cover, you know? And it's an interesting design challenge to not really make a new cover and to not really make a new book.
Yeah. And just as a kind of, just to go back as a sort of design detail, because most of you won't be holding the book, like the idea was that this sort of new edition was a sort of a physical layer. So it's a foil that's added to the original cover rather than it being kind of printed with or embedded within the original.
It's stamped.
Yeah, it's sort of like a stamp.
Yeah. So because we made these decisions with the cover, and because we made these decisions in general, we had to sort of enter a forensic design mode, which can best be described by this meme here. We don't know where this came from. We just found it. Someone handed it to us like
this morning.
Yeah. No one made it here. But the idea being that if you enhance and if you look deeply enough at something, and you will be shocked. So we ended up analyzing basically the grids, the typesetting, everything within the book, a la Riddick, and this is what we came out with. Maybe chat about this.
And so, I mean, this is just kind of zooming in on a a small section of translation, and so kind of leading on from this idea of adding onto the original content rather than embedding the design within it. This idea of a kind of a casual gesture of a highlight, like you would if you were going through a document yourself, became the kind of the linking device between the original or the translation and the expanded commentary.
Literally. So just to clarify, like what's highlighted here in yellow, and sorry, there's a classic graphic designers, there's a type formatting issue here, but what's highlighted here in yellow is like very different to what's in white here. Whereas in white, it's like so much more functional. In yellow, it's almost interpretive. It's almost like a commentary, like that. The way that we began to see what Winston was adding in his beautiful way to the process was adding in a way a director's commentary. Mm-hmm. He was sort of going very, very deep into the details and expanding out like concepts and nuances that frankly, like none of us had any idea, maybe not even Sophia. And it was like a really interesting thing, but it was fundamentally different from just referencing where that quote came from. It was really referencing or like explaining the context, and that needed to be thought of. Mm-hmm. So just going through the pages, this is the final book, essentially.
And we did, I mean, looking at the section, like we did borrow certain design characteristics from the old book. Like I'm pretty sure we maintained the baseline grid from the original book, but simply kind of utilized a typeface that was already there, but in a sort of slightly different way.
So we arranged the content into three sort of key areas, which is there's a front section which explains the context, like why is this important. So there's text from Jack and from Winston within here, and there's also a timeline of the book itself, because the book has this crazy history, and it's sort of like giving you the context of why does this exist. And then at this point we then hit the translated section, which is the essentially the guts of the project.
Yeah. And just to, again, a little sort of design detail is that we signal this shift in new and old content with like very, very subtle gestures. That being, if you go to the previous page, you can see that we use like a different paper stock to sort of like bookend the original translated content. Yeah, and there are certain like nice things with like, this map is like a wonderful thing, and we're always thinking about how Jack can expand his empire. And one of the ways we were thinking was like we could send a postcard. People could send postcards to kind of publicize, and tell people about the good word of Real and of Kommunen. Actually, I just remembered we had previously, there was another idea of having two covers. I think that was where the idea from the postcard came from, where you would. Well, that you'd be flicking through the book and you'd have the first cover, and then there'd be another kind of card cover slotted within, and so you'd feel where the old book. Well, yeah, because this is actually this is actually physically placed within the book. So any shrink wrap copy that you guys get, this will be within the book. So if you actually flick through it, it will stop at the point in which the translated book starts. Right. So if you want to just skip past Jack's introduction, skip past the timeline, just all of that irrelevant stuff, and just get straight to the good stuff, you can do that. So then here it's just an exercise of us matching the design exactly and just trying to not make any stupid mistakes, which like hopefully. I mean, I'm sure people will give us notes if there are any. And you'll see here that there's this yellow highlighting. So these are the situations in which Winston created or like added like a really interesting commentary about a certain quote or a certain diagram. A lot of the time it was based on quotes or based on anecdotal stuff, and that happens throughout the book, and it's only until you reach the final section. So there's a plate section which shows Ungers' wonderful photography, and there's a note to the notes. So we're calling this section like it's the back section, but it's really the kind of commentary. And you can see here there's kind of an index of every single highlighted section and explaining what that is. So the idea is that you could read through the original book from like cover to cover in itself, or conversely, you could run through the notes on the notes in of itself, or you can kind of like ping pong and reference one to the other.
It's like when someone gets a Criterion DVD with the director's commentary, they watch the movie first and then they watch it with the director's commentary and get a little bit more insight into what it is. And we try to keep it as minimal as possible while making it clear that this is a new element. Like there's a history here, there's a highlight, which has its own connotations.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it.
Well,
oh yes,
yeah, and then I mean, this is the last section. And it's just to kind of give a little bit more time on the sort of great efforts that went into reproducing the image part of the book. And so I think it's fair to say that it was a kind of a collaborative effort between ourselves and the printer Copa. Here they are.
Yeah, looking very Eastern European.
Yeah, exactly. And so here we're just sort of like breaking down the various stages of production, and we're kind of really zooming into this particular image, just to kind of like demonstrate how the image is composed. And in this particular instance, the image is unfortunately suffering from a little bit of moire, and to avoid the image being distorted yet again, we, as we previously mentioned, got in touch with Rome about how they went about printing their book. And there is this method of printing called stochastic, where instead of uniform dots, it is the dots are distributed randomly. And so there you can see in the first proof what that kind of technology looks like. But it took a fair bit of calibration and trial and error to kind of get it as close to the original as we possibly could. So there was sort of various stages in getting to that point. So hopefully the original and new look as similar to one another as is technologically possible in 2020.
No, we should just say that it's as close as possible. No one will ever get closer.
No one.
Even on the complete micro level or macro level. I don't know which one's applicable here.
Yeah.
But yeah, these are the kind of wonderful things that you have to deal with when you're trying to reproduce a book that's already been printed. So yeah, shout out to Copa because they did a wonderful job. And there was also a question of color and like updating the color, not to basically make it appear different, but maybe sort of the inks would have faded over time. So it's almost anticipating how that orange would have looked straight off the press, because it would have looked significantly brighter and more vivid. And that is it.
And thus is the conclusion.
Yeah, thus the book is born. 3 years. So there we are. Should we stop this yet?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't. How do we? There we go.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation, guys. I think if it's all right with you, we might run 10 minutes over just so we have enough time to maybe ask some questions. I guess the first thing, I think for me, the genius of this presentation that you've made and of your approach to the design of the book itself is this layering process and the way in which you've taken a historical document and added the contemporary simply through this kind of new layer, or primarily through this new layer. But I wondered, and maybe it's a big question to ask, but of course we also live in an era, to come back to the last question at the end of the last panel, about the kind of role that digital media and the internet plays in spreading ideas and so on. But it also has a big impact on the need for newness and a kind of flattening of that newness. Virgil Abloh famously only made a few percentile difference between previous designs and his own design. Wherever he felt there was no necessity for newness, he abandoned it. And at least for me, what was really interesting about your approach here was this, as you said, this insistence on on not doing something new. In order to do that, you had to do a phenomenal amount of work in order to make it look like it wasn't new. But I am very interested by that as an approach, and maybe just hearing you speak more broadly around the need for newness, or your relationship with that in this project or in other projects.
Go, Chris. You're made for this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's always that intent in making something brand new. But I have to say that, I mean, for me, it was quite clear when receiving the original thing that it was such a kind of a beautiful object, and functioned, you know, as well then as it could now, as the sort of, you know, vehicle of dissemination that I think that the newness came from representing it as close to the original as we possibly could. And you know, when I look at the cover and I see, you know, this very kind of minimal gesture,
it's confidence.
yeah. There is a kind of newness to it. I find it, and maybe that's because a lot of what I see maybe doesn't necessarily look like this, and so in that respect, like I find this to be a kind of a very fresh or new looking design artifact.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, without getting too deep with it, I totally agree with what Chris just said. Without getting too deep, just to add, without getting too deep with it, I think it's also interesting to be like making printed objects and using paper, shipping things across the world, working on computers, and like using a lot of energy to make something. And the question of like, okay, at what point are we gonna then play and like change the format, add in new Pantones, convince Jack or whatever publishing place to spend a whole lot of money to kind of satisfy the idea of it needing to be new. It seems a bit immoral and like a bit weird, a bit of a weird move. So I think analyzing where that desire for newness comes from, why does it need to feel new, and I don't know, like maybe it's also just Chris and my personality, where we question a lot why we're doing things and for who we're doing it for. And I think like a lot of the time our tendency, if I can speak for you, our tendency is to sort of like be inspired by the past, because there's so much that works in the past.
I think
aesthetically, functionally, spiritually.
I think the period in which this book was published is a kind of period in general that we both refer to and analyze a lot in our practice and in general.
And I think we have like, I mean, I certainly have like Rory and Ollie from OKRM, and friends like Shinla Pham, Joel Fear, like collaborators like Jack, like a lot of people who have like kind of allowed me to form this opinion on like, if I hadn't met all these people and worked in these places, I wouldn't have approached this project in that way. And that's just design, right?
I think there's also, I mean, just worth mentioning the kind of the economy of means, and you know, I think that there was a need to kind of consider the budget and how much budget there was to make a book like this, and you know, copying the design aside, you know, a paperback is a very efficient way of producing a book, and certainly something that appeals to me about design at the time in which this was published is the kind of, again, the economy of design, and how even with like, you know, two colors and a, you know, an image and a typeface, you can create, to me, what seems like a very beautiful, timeless, iconic cover and interior. So I think
you heard it here first. It's iconic.
Yes, I did say
well,
that.
I would definitely agree with everything you've said, and I think the thing which has maybe gone unsaid or not explicitly there is that the context in which something appears is in itself a contribution to the design in a way that I don't think it was perhaps previously. And I think at the moment at which this book was originally published in 1972, objects had to be much more discrete. They had to be more self-contained, and they presented a whole worldview when they arrived. Now everything seems to be much more situated within, complex communities of communication. And for me, the true, newness of this book is the moment at which it arrives. So let's say, is it relevant at the moment at which it's published? And the layer of the contemporary which is added to it, which is why I'm such a big admirer of that layer approach within the book, because I think that's what highlights that relevance. And therefore, the fact that there's apparently, and I use that term advisedly, apparently no change from the original, actually only highlights the kind of context in which it gets published. So like, why is someone doing this? Why is someone making this book and expending all this energy to create something which apparently already existed? So I think, and maybe the only broader comment I would make, I started this panel by saying it's quite rare to have, graphic designers or type designers give a presentation during the launch of a book. That's something I would like to see change. And I hope that this can, serve as a model for others. Because I do think that what draws design, the type of design that you do and the type of design that might be present in many of the architects who are in this event right now is that we work with typologies and we work with standards which are developed and evolved over a long period of time. And that doesn't mean always reinventing or working from ground zero every single time you approach something, but taking a typology and evolving it. And in that sense, I want to thank you both for your presentation, and thank you so much for the work that you've put into this book to advancing the typology of the translation as a design object. I want to thank Anya, Winston, and Sophia for being in the first panel, for all of the incredible work they've done to make this publication possible. I want to thank our audience for turning up, and please go and buy the book. I think that's pretty much it from us. And to any of you who are thinking of hosting your own online events, as I mentioned, I hope this can serve as a typological example for you as well. So I think that's it from me. A big thank you to everyone, and we'll be in touch very soon, I'm sure.
Yes.
Great.
Enjoy the book.
Yes, enjoy.
Thank you. All right.
Bye.
See you.